welcome Meera Nair. Meera, in the maybe late 70s, 80s, you were a very, very distant relative of mine. When you
I still am.
Wait, when you called me in New York to come and see your film, I didn't go, I don't remember for what reason, maybe I was neck deep in babies and diapers. But now you're a successful, at that time you were, I think, just starting, it was one of your early films, and now you're a successful filmmaker. So now you're a very close relative. Very close actually, because you are my father's sister's daughter's husband's sister's daughter.
Exactly.
In Punjabi terms, it's very close.
We like that.
Yes, absolutely. And now I see all your films, although I didn't see that one. What struck me was, in seeing a lot of your interviews and doing research, what Satyajit Ray said about your film Salaam Bombay. And that was the time when I first interviewed you, when that film came out, and it was absolutely spectacular. He said, "I cannot recall ever being impressed so much by a first feature. It is completely unlike any film ever made in India. It shows complete command of every aspect of the medium." Do you think this film has lived up to that, The Reluctant Fundamentalist?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I really make my films with as much rigor and as much passion and as much power or beauty, whatever, but I don't sit around analyzing how I've done. That is for you to do and other people to do. But because, I go right into it. And but I hope that he would say the same about The Reluctant Fundamentalist.
The structure of the film really zeroes in on two very important aspects of this last decade, which is the collapse of the financial world in America. And in your film, it is also about the drive and the greed of the American financial world and international terrorism. The book is a monologue. You have created a dialogue, very, very different from the book. In this, he's talking to himself in the book all the time. And with you, you're hearing the other side also, which is a complete change in terms of concept. That you've created a dialogue between the Americans and the Islamic world. Whereas his is one long monologue, sort of telling his story, justifying how he got to be where he was. So if you'd followed the book, it would have become an arty French film, leave it to the audience to decide what happened. Whereas in your film, it's very clear. In fact, I don't know why you bought the rights. Because if you change the names and the writer went to a judge and said, "This is my book," it would be hard to put the two together.
Actually, you're the first person to say that it is almost another book entirely, so I'm quite surprised.
It takes a lot of guts to say it, I must say. It's tough for me to say it, and scary.
A book is a springboard for my imagination to making a film. It's not, no book is in an adaptation to be prescribed page by page into a film, because film is an entirely different medium and has to be treated as such. But my first inspiration to make this film actually came from visiting Lahore for the first time and being deeply moved by what I saw and what we don't know about Pakistan, whether we live in India or in America. It is not the Pakistan that you read about in the newspapers, what I confronted in Lahore. So that extraordinary largesse, that refinement in any medium of the arts, the extraordinary music, the painting, all of that, and mostly the spirit of the people, was something that I just felt I must make a film about contemporary Pakistan. And it was only about 18 months after that trip that I read Mohsin's book, The Reluctant Fundamentalist. And for me, it was, it gave me not only the way to make a modern tale about today's Lahore, but it was also for me, like Mohsin, I have lived in both countries for a long time.
Three countries.
Yeah, and it gave me the possibility of a real dialogue with America, because yes, in the book, Chengiz speaks in a monologue to an American who listens but does not speak, because that was Mohsin's very clever sort of conceit about the fact that we in the subcontinent are always spoken for, and he's going to make a book where the subcontinent will speak and the listener will not, But in a movie, you have two men at a table in a tea house in Lahore, and the other man has to have some interaction with the man who is speaking. So when we first began the adaptation, in fact, with Mohsin Hamid and Ami Bogani, we actually dismissed of the artifice of them at a tea house speaking. We made the story another way entirely. And it was only in the third draft that we went back to the artifice of them sitting at a table and using the spine of the book, the spine of this conversation, to interweave Chengiz's coming of age to find out who he really is. So Bobby had to be invented, and I tried to, with Mohsin and Ami and William Wheeler, tried to invent him as a character with as much sort of contradiction and complexity and nuance as we did Chengiz, you know.
That was a beautiful moment when he says, "I see you as hash under your fingernails." And that whole description of to assess people in the financial world, how he brought us to his back to Lahore.
That's right.
And how he
in his life. I mean, he
yes.
is an analyst.
Yes.
And that analysis keeps going on. That's who you become because you're taught how to do that. You know, I've always been interested in that character, the character of Bobby, the character of an outsider in this country, the foreigner who comes to the subcontinent to want to belong and to learn the language, to be a part of the society, but does that belonging ever happen? That notion has always interested me, you know, in terms of even the Fraser brothers and the Raj, or so many Graham Greene characters. That character has always fascinated me. So we brought that idea of the outsider who wants to come here to do good, in a sense, to be involved, to write about freedom struggle as Bobby does and so on. But then the question is, can a settler ever become a native? That's the character that I was trying to invent with Bobby.
But that also applies to Chengiz Khan, that when you show him in America, how he adjusts to the financial and the American world, his style of speaking, Americanisms, and I think that very strong immigrant experience of always being conscious of yourself, so much the veneer of yourself, that very often, as you show in the layers of your film, you lose yourself, your old self. And it becomes a very complicated, layered, sometimes dysfunctional, and that comes across in your film. You've lived abroad a large part of your life, and I don't know if you've read Alba Amber. She wrote, "You ain't white, you ain't black, you ain't shit." In your film, Mississippi Masala, there is that the ones who weren't white and weren't black, and they were at that time treated like shit and thrown out of Uganda. You made a film about that. And so there have been many layers in your career where you've dealt with this issue, that when you are an immigrant, you never forget your skin, which is something you forget when you're at home. But you being in the creative world, I'm sure, do not feel it as acutely as somebody like, say, Chengiz Khan has to get absorbed and keep up with the Americanisms as you would if you're living in New York or in Africa or anywhere. Because in the creative world, there's almost a buffer, isn't there?
Well, in my world, you know, I take great sort of strength in being distinct. You know, I've never tried to be like other people wherever I am. My roots are strong, and that's why I can fly, I suppose, you know. So I take great care to not be anything other than I am, you know. And one can be at home in places, but I never feel like I've lost myself in that world. And also, I don't think of myself as an immigrant. You know, I didn't go from India to America to become one, and I haven't become one. You know, but I find in my work, it is about this seesaw of moving between worlds and finding out who you genuine self is. In this movie, it's more so because it's more complicated. It's about a divided self in a globalizing world.
Also in Namesake.
Yes, also in Namesake.
Same sort of.
In Namesake, in a way, it's simpler because it's about a family. Yeah. But in The Reluctant Fundamentalist, it's really about, you know, the issues that affect us all and the silence that we will never know of our voices from the subcontinental world. We really only get the American voice, and usually, you know. So what this book gave me and what the story gave me is actually the possibility to create a dialogue between these two characters, but really a dialogue between these two worlds.
Was Muhsin's intention the opposite? That he was giving it as a monologue, that you don't let us have a voice?
I think so.
And you changed it to a dialogue.
Yes.
Which is, again, reaching out.
Yes.
That's remarkable.
Yes.
That you saw that in that. Because when I read the book,
yeah,
I was extremely irritated throughout the book because this device of...
Yes, it's a device. Yeah.
Device of saying the questions that the other person who's never heard.
Yes.
That you ask,
yes.
How would I know this if I was not on the inside?
I mean, not to speak for Mohsin, but I think his idea was that we are always spoken for, and it's about time we speak for ourselves.
And also, it's hard to imagine a man talking to another man saying, and her naked body felt soft next to me.
Yes.
I mean, it's
an artifice.
Irritating that, if you're going to talk, if it's a conversation, then talk like people talk.
Yeah.
Or write like people talk.
Yeah.
When you're used to people writing in a language like your collaborator on many of your films, Suni, who writes how people actually talk.
Yeah.
So for you to take a book which is, to me, the most unfriendly book to make into a screenplay, it's a work of genius, I think, to even see that it's possible.
But when you understand how the inspiration came, then you can make that, I made that leap. I love his work, actually, and in this book it gave me the possibility to expand it. That's me as a filmmaker. I look at work sometimes that inspires me, but that I can also amplify to my interests, to my interests. Like, my father grew up in Lahore, and he raised us, knowing the poems of Faiz Ahmad Faiz, knowing the ghazals, knowing the culture in that way. So that first union with that culture was a moving one. So in my version of the book, in my version of the film, I brought all that. It's not in the book, whether the qawwalis and the kidnapping, the reason the men are meeting, the reason why it's all happening. All these things have to be kind of explained, but explained in a way that I want to explain them, with the layers of the culture that we assume, but we don't see ever on screen.
What you deal with is how even Erica starts seeing him differently, no matter how hard she tries, because Americans were traumatized by 9/11.
Yeah.
And they did start seeing things differently.
Yeah.
And your film has been released so close to the Boston bombing that I'm sure that again raises many questions. Do you think this coincidence will hurt or damage or help your film?
Well, it's incredible, really, how the film has become so uncannily prescient, And on the publicity tour with this film, showing it in commercial spaces in Boston, in Los Angeles, in New York, before the bombings happened, I encountered an incredible curiosity and hunger and a real sense of affinity with this film, like they needed the film to understand what they are never shown. Because, in the last 12 years, since 9/11, when Bush said, you're either with us or against us, he created this wall, this schism. And a lot of spin, a lot of media, a lot of movies have been made about Iraq, about Afghanistan, about the American involvement in this part of the world. But it's always about the American soldiers. It's always about the Americans. It's never about where they go, where you never see even the name of a character that the bomb has been dropped upon, So the Americans have never known that side of the effect of the war or the effect of the policy that their government is on. So this film is unusual in that it's really a two-hander. It's a conversation, and it's a conversation that sometimes says virtually the unsayable. Many people might have felt that, but no one speaks about it with that type of complexity and that kind of openness to be prickly about something that is not so simple to speak about. So that was a very interesting reaction, and it was a very genuine reaction. And then the Boston bombings happened, which was just so tragic and so unexpected. And still, my feeling is we are defined not just by the events that happen, but we are defined by the reaction we have to these events. And the reaction to the Boston bombings were very similar in some ways to the reaction to 9/11, in the sense that racial profiling happened immediately. The poor Indian Tripathi was nailed in Brown University as being the person. I was myself, completely, this is even before the bombings, just a week before, completely almost strip searched in a LaGuardia airport just because my bangles beeped and they just went insane and called me, this woman is alarming, they started screaming and stuff like that. The profiling and the surveillance and the kind of...
Were you wearing Indian clothes?
I always wear Indian clothes, so yeah, I was, So all that atmosphere of quick softly pointing fingers at people who may not look like the classic blonde has been rampant for a long time. But also it is coupled with a genuine ignorance of the rest of the world. And this was what this film seemed to be, you know, filling that hole. And done with, I think, a fair amount of intimacy and love of the American side as well. It wasn't just a dartboard which says the Americans are bad. It talks about both sides, you know. So that was what I was really experiencing, that hunger. And after the Boston bombings, people looked to the film to gain greater enlightenment on how can this happen. You know, because America is an incredibly open place, but it has an illusion. The dream is still alive, but the dream can accept you and also cast you out, you know, in the slightest of ways or in the deepest of ways. And this is what people don't have a sense of in there. And this is what the film also does outline in a way. Not that that's the recipe for radicalization, because this film is not about how he gets radicalized. This film is about how he wakes up to understand what the principles of fundamentals are, you know, that link money with terror and more, and how he understands his own self, and how Bobby also comes to that realization himself. So
in the end, that is really that look in his face when he discovers the truth, when he looks in the film. So I don't want to get into it in detail, it's a spoiler. Now, one of the things that you mentioned just now is that you went into areas which people don't talk about. And what struck me as a very powerful scene was when he describes his reaction when he sees the planes crash. On television. He's in another country. He sees the planes crash on television into the World Trade Center, and you really laid it bare over there. He says, I know I should have felt sorrow or anger, but all I really felt was awe. The audacity, ruthlessness of the act was surpassed only by its genius. David had struck Goliath. But before conscience kicks in, have you never felt a split second of pleasure at arrogance brought low? That was so powerful because it brings in everything. It brings in both sides of the world. Very brave of you to show that there is an element where people do want to bring you down, but we still want to have a dialogue. That's extremely complicated. What kind of reaction did you get? Did anyone point out that that's why we react like this to Islam and Muslims, because they are happy that this happened, to simplify it?
Not so bluntly, not so bluntly. People like deal with it, not the equation you made, no, but they begin to understand that the world is really much more complicated than they allowed themselves to think. And yes, you've quoted this correctly, but it's also beyond that. He explains the context to Bobby, and he says, I'm sure you must feel this way when 100,000 children are killed in Afghanistan or in Pakistan or Baghdad or wherever for that matter. So we equated. What I tried to do is to be unflinching about the complexity of that reaction. Actually, we had very interesting reactions to that in America. One time in a public screening in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, which is a fairly upscale neighborhood, a sort of 40-year-old white middle-class woman stood up and said, you know, this is the first time I have seen what I believe and what I felt on a screen. And thank you so much for it, because I was isolated in this feeling. I felt like I couldn't even express myself. And now your characters have, and I feel a sense of finally we can see some aspect of a truth that we have been denied in being shown, you know, which was astounding, you know, to publicly get up and say, this is me, you know, this is what I felt. So that is also America. People are open. People want to know, and they do believe, but but the spin is so controlled that you don't have access to that. You feel isolated in that feeling, you know. So in the film, we are careful not to celebrate that in any kind of lighter way, but it is the world, you know, the world is complicated, and the world has become even more so since that, you know, dastardly act.
But don't you think that Americans do not really equate people being bombed and killed in Afghanistan and in Iraq or wherever they are for the moment? Because most Americans don't think about it. They don't think of people, women and children being killed by their soldiers in the same way as the people who are suffering that, or people in that region. I
mean, because they are prevented from seeing that. They literally are not shown the world, that half of the world, and which is a huge part of my reason to make this film. you know, because I lament the one-sidedness of the argument. And I feel like the world deserves more, you know, it is a rich place. And Americans too, like any of us, deserve to know more. Because when they see, policies will have to change. The hand has to be reached out, and the hand must not control a drone. You know, that has to happen, because look at where we are today, 12 years later. How many wars? You know, much worse, you know, much more destruction. And why? Because a policy was taken that you're either a good guy or you're a bad guy. And we're not even going further than that. I mean, it's very, very black or white. And I just think that's a great suffering, and I think that we have to ask for more. We have to ask for a different attitude to deal with the world.
He says in one of the phrases, violence has wormed its way into my life. What was hard became harder. What was soft fell away. Do you think that is also a message that you're giving in the film about the Americans and Erica as well as Genghis Khan, or is it from the Pakistani point of view?
No, I didn't think about that line as a national thing, you know, Pakistani versus America or anything like that. More when your better self begins to recede, you have to ask yourself the question, where are you? And what am I doing here that makes me become hard like this? You know, that makes me lose my humanity like this.
And that comes up again in the film when he says something to Erica and she says, I didn't know you were capable of such cruelty. Which pushes that the situation that he is exposed to, the harassment, and then going into her show, and he comes out and he says terrible things to her, and which brings you to the same point that he is becoming harder. And he is becoming cruel.
Well, he is becoming harder because he has suffered a series of humiliations and never expected, always expected the refuge of being understood by his lover, by his beloved, you know, whom he really believed was his lover, I mean, his partner in life. He didn't treat her anything but seriously. And again, her own short-sightedness or her own going awry, thinking that she was making him a love poem by knowing whatever she knew of his culture, but actually kind of being deeply unprivate about so much that she didn't know about. That was the ultimate betrayal for him.
Was that also, or am I reading things, it was also a statement about art and how people use in books and in film and in art, that they use private lives to expose it to a point where it shouldn't. There should be some restraint.
I think, you know, it's about this whole feeling of feeling entitled to take a person's culture or take a person's life in the culture or whatever, and feeling a sense of entitlement that I can interpret something which you think you know, but you have no humility. And you don't know the depth of that culture. Actually, you don't know the culture at all. But yeah, it is a comment on that, you know, more than, yeah, that's definitely, I've seen it time and time again. People coming to this part of the world thinking they're helping or saving, but interpreting it in a very, you know, superficial manner.
It took you 5 years to make this film.
Yeah. I mean, I made another film during those 5 years, but it was basically 5 years of great creative thought.
You turned down a very lucrative offer.
That was before the 5 years.
And you made something that you really believed in.
Yeah.
The average person, I don't think, realizes the kind of sweat, the cajoling, the approaching studios, getting the money. And can you tell us a little bit about what went into making this?
Sure. I mean, firstly, the adaptation had to be a very skillful one, and it was a very...
I've never seen an adaptation so skillful.
Yeah, thank you.
It is amazing.
Thank you. So that took 3 years to make, and parallel to the adaptation, to the writing, I was looking for the young man to play Chengiz, because it's such a hard and such a complicated and beautiful role, but it's very tough to find a 20-something young person who can speak in Urdu, who can be an Ivy League boy and ascend Wall Street, who can bed Kate Hudson beautifully, and who can go off and ruthlessly shut down car factories in the Philippines and then come back home. And come back home to Pakistan and be a part of a very genuine Lahori family and feel authentic. So that took a year and a half to find Riz Ahmed, who made the most, I think, charismatic performance in this film. But then, after we had the screenplay and we had these extraordinary actors, Kate Hudson and KF, you know, the casting actually took 6 months after I found Chinguez, because everything was hinged around Chinguez. And we got the most extraordinary cast from both sides of the world. But even then, the financing took an enormous amount of time. And I didn't go to the studios because I'm savvy about studios. I don't want to go to places which they'll just show me the door or censor it beyond belief before I even begin. So I went to independent financiers, and I know people around the world. And we had a global ambition for this film. It is about globalization. It is about the world. You know, it had to be shot in 3 or 4 continents. That was otherwise the scope would be so reduced, and we wouldn't be able to get into the whole debate about the fundamentalism of profit, the fundamentalism of terror. So in a way, this whole film and the global film, I mean, we did shoot in New York City, we did shoot in Turkey, and we did shoot in Lahore, and we did shoot in Delhi, but we created Philippines in Noida, we created Turkey in Connaught Place, we created, you know, Williamsburg, Brooklyn in Atlanta. So nothing is really as it may seem, but actually feels very close to exactly what it's supposed to be.
Meera, you're one of the few filmmakers who, after having made a film, has gone back to helping the people that were portrayed in your film. Salaam Balak Trust came about after your film Salaam Bombay, and today is a highly successful, amazing work is done over there. Young kids who become adults and are professionals now, working, had families of their own. How much do you go there? Do you contribute more than having started it? How much are you involved with it?
I mean, I am, you know, I'm not, it's just unbelievable in sense of pride about the thriving quality, the fact that we've actually impacted government policy on street children and changed lives like one at a time for the last 25 years. And we just re-released Salaam Bombay for its 25th anniversary this year. I was thrilled to see the film again because it feels so modern, but what was extraordinary was the 25 years of Salaam Balak Trust and the fact that
it's modern and a classic.
Ah, thank you. I really feel amazed that it came through me and came through all of us who made the film. But I'm involved with Salaam Balak in the sense that I go there 3 times a year and I work with kids who want me to help them. A lot of people are in the arts and they always want, you know, introductions here and there. But I also use every single one of my films all over the world to benefit Salaam Balak so that it can continue.
As far back as 1987, you made a film about prenatal gender selection.
That's right.
And today it is huge. In fact, it is so huge that they become completely lopsided in many states in India. How was it you got to that subject in 1987, which nobody was even thinking about at that time?
I came to cinema by studying in the cinema verite tradition, the cinema of truth, through the documentary filmmakers Ricky Leacock and Penny Baker. And so life became cinema rather than, you know, fiction, you know. And I've always thought there's nothing stranger and more powerful than life, you know, instead of fiction. And in the course of making a film about cabaret dancers called India Cabaret in 1984 in Bombay, I came across this very secret but pretty populated clinics in Bombay that offered amniocentesis for sex selection. So that's what, you know, when you keep your eyes open and you keep your pulse on the ground of the world, if you really are remaining a student of life, then life tells you this is what the subject is, this is the core of what's going on. And that's why I made that film. It wasn't someone who asked me to do that or anything. It came from living on the street and seeing what the street was doing. It was pretty shocking, and also it was very interesting going into it because you think, oh, it's terrible, how can this be? But when I started living in the lab that actually performed these tests, and I hung out for 3, 4, 5 months with women who would come in, the notion would be that the men would make them do that. But so many times it was the women who had internalized that they needed a boy rather than a girl. And often the men didn't even want them to go through that. So it was a very interesting and very complicated and painful seesaw to witness. But that is life, you know.
Many of your films actually have been because you have been in certain areas or sought those areas to find information, research.
It's about awareness.
And, even Cabaret, for example. I mean,
Yeah.
many films have been made, but it's different to see it from their point
Well,
of view.
you know, I've always questioned who decides who is respectable, who is outside respectability. Who decides? Why should we obey that someone has decided that this person is noble and that person is evil? I've always, I don't know how and why, but since a kid.
I think it's from Lahore.
Ever
Because
since-
I think I got that from my father also.
Must have
I
been.
think it's a Lahore thing that you admire the courtesan, you admire the ghazal singer. There's nobody that
Yeah.
you don't respect.
Yeah.
Because each one has their
Maybe,
own.
you know, because I've always bridled against these labels that people put and, you know, judge people, you know. I've never believed in that type of judgment, you know. I've always questioned that who are you to decide that I am this or that, you know. And the films became, I suppose, about that questioning, you know. Yeah. And I hope I keep questioning.
I'm sure you will.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mira.
Thank
They
you.
tell me that I have to stop.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
We could
for
carry
your
on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madhavi.